Rain slid down the windshield of an old pickup truck as it rolled slowly through the empty street. The wipers worked tiredly, squeaking every few seconds, pushing away sheets of water that blurred the world outside. Behind the wheel sat James Carter, a 71-year-old black veteran with a face lined by time and memories. His hands, though aged, still carried the quiet steadiness of a soldier. On the passenger seat, a brown paper bag held a loaf of bread, some milk, and his favorite black coffee. He had just left the grocery store and was heading home. It was a short drive, one he had made countless times. But that night, something felt different, like the air itself was watching. As James turned onto Miller Avenue, the glow of red and blue lights suddenly filled his mirrors. He frowned. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong. His taillights worked fine. He was driving under the limit. Still, he slowed down, signaled, and pulled to the side of the road. The rain made soft tapping sounds on the roof as the lights reflected off every drop. He took a deep breath and whispered to himself, "Stay calm, son. Stay calm." Old habits from decades in uniform never left him. He rolled down his window halfway, placed both hands on the steering wheel, and waited. 2 police officers stepped out of the patrol car. They looked young, barely in their 30s, faces hardened with the arrogance of power that hadn't yet been tested by real life. One shone his flashlight directly into James's eyes. The other approached the back of the truck, tapping his flashlight against the metal tailgate as if looking for an excuse. "Evenin', sir," the first one said, his tone sharp. "Know why we stopped you tonight?" James shook his head gently. "No, officer. I don't believe I did anything wrong." "Your left tail light's out," the officer said, pretending to scribble on a small notepad. James frowned. "That can't be right. I checked them just this morning." The second officer came closer, smirking. "You callin' us liars, old man?" James's voice stayed calm. "No, sir. Just saying I maintain my truck carefully. Maybe you could show me?" The 2 officers exchanged a look. The one with the smirk stepped even closer, leaning down to James's window. "You know, most people don't talk back when we pull them over. You got something to hide?" James felt his chest tighten. He'd faced far worse, gunfire, explosions, battlefields, but something about this moment felt colder. It wasn't about danger. It was about disrespect. Still, he smiled faintly and said, "Only thing I'm hiding is a long day and a tired back." The younger cop laughed and muttered, "Guess the army doesn't teach humility." That made James pause. He looked at the badge shining under the rain. "Army taught me a lot of things, son. Respect being one of them." The words hung in the air. The second officer's grin faded. He didn't like being corrected. "Step out of the vehicle," he snapped. James hesitated. "Is that necessary, officer? Did I stutter?" He sighed, unbuckled his seatbelt, and opened the door slowly. Rain hit his jacket, running down his weathered face. The officers stood close, one with his hand near his holster, though there was no reason to be afraid. James raised his hands slightly, showing he carried nothing. "Turn around," the first cop ordered. "Gonna check you for weapons." James obeyed, spreading his arms. The young man patted him down roughly, almost enjoying it. When he found nothing, he still gave a small push to his shoulder. "You got an attitude, old man. Think your medals make you special?" James turned his head slightly. "No. But they remind me of the men I buried so you could stand there free." That silenced them for a second. Rain poured harder. The night grew heavier. The second officer's jaw tightened. "You trying to be smart with me?" "I'm just answering your question." The cop suddenly shoved him, not hard enough to throw him down, but enough to make the old man stumble against his truck door. His hand hit the metal with a dull thud. James winced. The other officer laughed quietly. Relax, he's fine. James steadied himself and took a long, slow breath. You boys done? That sentence carried something different. It wasn't anger. It was control. The tone of a man who'd seen fear before and wasn't impressed by it. But to them, it sounded like defiance. The first cop stepped closer, eyes flashing. What's that supposed to mean? James didn't respond. He looked past them, at the reflection of the flashing lights in the puddles, at the lonely road disappearing into the dark. He knew nothing he said would change how they saw him. His calmness only made them angrier. Turn around, the officer shouted again. Officer, James said softly, you don't have to do this. Then came another shove, harder this time. His back hit the edge of the door. His knees bent slightly, and for a second, the world spun. His hand reached for balance and hit his phone, which slid out of his pocket and landed on the wet ground, screen glowing faintly. A small red light blinked on. The camera had started recording. Neither officer noticed. Don't move, the first one barked. James lifted his head. I'm not. His voice carried calm strength again, but behind it, a quiet sadness. Check the truck, the second one ordered. He opened the passenger door, rummaging through the grocery bag, spilling the bread and coffee onto the seat. Nothing but food. What a surprise. The other officer smirked. Probably bought it with some retirement money from Uncle Sam, huh? Must be nice. James stared at them silently. The rain kept falling. The water ran down his gray beard. He thought of his son, Marcus, how proud he was when Marcus joined the service. How he told him, no matter what happens, son, wear that uniform with honor. He wondered what Marcus would think if he saw this. When the officers finally returned to their car, one of them tossed the bag back onto the seat. You can go, old man. Try not to drive with broken lights next time. James nodded, climbed back into his truck, and sat still for a moment. His chest rose and fell slowly. He didn't start the engine right away. Instead, he looked down at his phone on the floor. The screen was still glowing. The camera icon still red. He picked it up and saw the entire recording, their words, their laughter, the push, everything. His hands shook slightly, not from fear but from disbelief. He had fought wars in foreign lands, stood against enemies armed with guns and hate, but never thought he'd face this kind of battle on his own street. He placed the phone on the dashboard, pressed save, and whispered, "Guess the truth fights its own wars now." Then he started the engine and drove off slowly. The truck disappeared down the road, its headlights cutting through the rain like a tired soldier walking home. But somewhere deep inside, James knew this wasn't over. The world had changed since his days in uniform. Cameras saw what people ignored. And somewhere far away, across a dark ocean, his son Marcus would soon see what had happened. The screen of the phone lit again as the video automatically uploaded to his cloud account, set to share with one person. The name blinked softly, son, Marcus. Miles away, in a dim military base under foreign skies, a phone buzzed. A soldier glanced down, seeing the alert. He frowned, pressed play, and his jaw tightened as the video showed his father being shoved and mocked in the rain. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he stood, his expression cold and controlled. The soldier's name tag read, Carter, M. He whispered to himself, they messed with the wrong man's father. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky as if the world itself knew something was about to change. And back home, James Carter sat quietly at his kitchen table, holding a warm cup of coffee in hands that had seen both war and peace, unaware that his son had already decided that this time, the war was personal. The night was silent inside the U.S. military base halfway across the world. The desert wind howled against the metal walls of the barracks, rattling loose panels like whispers from ghosts. Inside one of the dimly lit rooms sat Marcus Carter, his back straight, eyes locked on the small phone screen in his hand. The glow from the video lit his face, a strong, calm face trained never to show emotion. But tonight, that calm was cracking. He had watched the video 4 times already. Each time he replayed it, he caught something new: the sound of rain on the truck, the way his father's voice stayed calm even while being mocked, the push that made his old man stumble. The phone shook slightly in his hand. The men around him, soldiers, killers, professionals, stayed silent. No one dared speak when Marcus was in that kind of mood. Marcus was not just any soldier. He was a Delta Force commander, a man who had led missions no one would ever hear about. He was known for never losing control, never raising his voice, and never, ever acting out of emotion. But as he stared at the image of his father, wet, humiliated, and alone, something inside him shifted. "Sir," one of his teammates finally said quietly, "is that your dad?" Marcus didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened, his thumb paused on the replay button. "Yeah," he said finally. "That's my father." The room went still. Every man in that unit knew what that meant. James Carter wasn't just Marcus's dad, he was a legend. A Vietnam veteran who had saved dozens of soldiers when his platoon was ambushed. A man who earned medals for bravery but never bragged about them. He taught his son everything about discipline, about honor, about what it meant to serve your country. And now, 2 young cops had treated that same man like a nobody. Marcus set his phone down on the metal table and stood. The light from above caught the scar running along his left arm, a reminder of a mission gone wrong years ago. He reached for his duffel bag, pulled out his military jacket, and zipped it up with quiet precision. "Where are you going?" his second-in-command, Harris, asked, though he already knew. "Home," Marcus said flatly. "Sir, command isn't gonna like that. You're not cleared to leave yet." Marcus turned his eyes toward him. There was no anger there, only certainty. "Then they can fire me after I'm done. My father was attacked. I'm going home." No one tried to stop him. They all knew it was useless. When Marcus made up his mind, nothing stood in his way. Hours later, as the military transport plane cut through the dark skies, Marcus sat near the window, headphones on, watching the city lights fade behind him. His mind wasn't quiet. Every memory of his father played in fragments: the times James taught him how to stand tall, how to look a man in the eyes, how to never raise his hand in hate, but never let injustice pass either. He remembered his father's voice from when he was 10 years old, after Marcus got into a fight protecting another boy. "Son, there's a difference between fighting for pride and fighting for what's right. Never confuse the two." Marcus closed his eyes. "I'm not fighting for pride, Dad," he whispered. "I'm fighting for you." When the plane landed 12 hours later, the cold morning air of home hit his face like a slap. He moved through the airport quickly, his head up, his steps steady. No one recognized him, but a few people glanced at him, the kind of man whose presence drew attention without trying. He didn't go to his father's house right away. First, he went to see someone else, a friend from his time in the Rangers, now working as a local security consultant. A man who could find anyone and anything. "Marcus Carter," the friend said, shaking his head when he opened the door. "It's been years. Didn't think you'd ever come back here." "Didn't plan to," Marcus replied. "But something happened." He placed his phone on the table and pressed play. The room filled with the sound of rain, police voices, and his father's quiet strength. By the time it ended, the man's face had changed. "You want names?" "I want everything," Marcus said. "Names. Addresses. Records. Their entire history." The man nodded slowly. "You know what this means, right? You're going to war on home soil." Marcus gave a faint smile, one without humor. "Then I'll treat it like any other battlefield." Within hours, he had everything: badge numbers, names, even their shift schedules. Officers Ryan Blake and Eddie Cole. Young, aggressive, already with a few complaints buried under paperwork. Marcus studied their faces on his laptop screen. He zoomed in, memorizing every detail. Later that night, he finally drove to his father's small house on the edge of town. The porch light was on. Inside, James Carter sat at the table, a cup of coffee steaming in front of him, the same quiet look on his face as always. When he saw Marcus at the door, his eyes widened, then softened. "You came home." Marcus stepped inside and hugged him tightly. "Of course I did." James chuckled weakly. "You didn't need to, son. It's over. They let me go." Marcus pulled back and looked him in the eyes. "They didn't let you go, Dad. They humiliated you." James shook his head. "I fought my battles long ago, son. I don't need to fight this one." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Then let me fight it for you." James sighed and looked at his son with tired pride. "You've already fought enough for both of us." He reached across the table and placed his hand on Marcus's. "Don't lose yourself trying to fix a broken world." For a moment, silence filled the room. The clock ticked softly in the corner. Then Marcus spoke, voice calm but cold. "The world doesn't need fixing, Dad. It needs reminding." That night, after his father went to bed, Marcus sat outside on the porch, staring at the rain-soaked street. The same road where it had happened. He closed his eyes and listened to the distant hum of traffic, imagining how it must have felt for his father, alone, disrespected, powerless. He pulled out his phone and replayed the video again. This time, he focused not on the officers, but on his father's calm expression. There was no fear, only dignity. And that dignity deserved justice. He opened another app on his phone, a secure communication line used by his old team. He typed a single message: "Need intel support. Personal mission. Civilian target. No casualties." Within seconds, a reply came: "Understood, Commander. We're with you." Marcus leaned back, the shadows from the porch light stretching across his face. He knew this wasn't just about two cops anymore. It was about something larger, about respect, about memory, about showing a system that even quiet men like his father had someone watching over them. The next morning, the police station across town buzzed with tension. The video had begun circulating on social media. People were sharing it with captions like "This is what happens to our veterans" and "Justice for James Carter." The officers involved still didn't know who the old man's son was. They laughed about it in the locker room, calling it just another internet thing. But outside, a black SUV was parked quietly across the street. Inside it sat Marcus, watching. His eyes followed every person entering and leaving the station. He wasn't there to threaten anyone. He was studying them, how they walked, how they talked, who they respected, who they feared. In his ear, through a small earpiece, came the voice of one of his men back overseas. "Commander, local chatter shows internal pressure building. Video's gone national in a few hours. Do you want to make a move?" "Not yet," Marcus said. "They'll make the next move. I'll be waiting." He ended the call and leaned back in the driver's seat. His father once told him that patience wins wars. Tonight, he was going to prove it. The sky grew darker. Streetlights flickered on. Across town, two nervous officers started to realize that the world was watching them. But they didn't know that something far more dangerous was watching, too, something calm, disciplined, and deadly. Marcus Carter smiled faintly as he looked at their pictures one last time. "You mocked the wrong man," he whispered. "And you just woke up his son." The sound of thunder echoed again over the city. To everyone else, it was just another storm. But for Marcus, it was the beginning of something far more powerful, a quiet war for justice that had already begun. The morning sun barely crept over the city, casting long, pale shadows across the streets. Rain from the previous night still glistened on the asphalt, turning it into a mirror that reflected flickering streetlights and the occasional passerby. James Carter moved slowly through his small home, making coffee as he always did. His body ached from the previous night, but more than the bruises and the soreness, his pride felt wounded. Yet, beneath it all, there was a quiet strength. He had survived wars, lost friends, and faced enemies that would make most men tremble. This, 2 young officers mocking him in the rain, was something he could endure. He didn't know that outside, hidden in the shadows of a black SUV parked across the street, Marcus Carter was already watching. The Delta Force commander had not slept. He had spent the night gathering intel, memorizing the officers' routines, noting their weaknesses, and planning his moves carefully. Marcus didn't seek violence, but he sought justice, and he was methodical in everything he did. As James sat at the kitchen table sipping his coffee, he thought of his son. Marcus had always been disciplined, steady, and calm, just like his father had trained him. Yet, James sensed that tonight, or perhaps even this morning, Marcus would do something different, something that would remind the world that wrongs could not go unpunished. Hours passed. The city began to stir. People moved about their routines, unaware of the silent storm building just a few streets away. James stepped outside onto his porch to check the weather. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wet earth. He sighed, running a hand over his gray hair. He was proud of his son, but part of him worried. Marcus didn't just fight enemies, he dismantled them. From the SUV, Marcus observed his father, taking in every detail. James moved carefully, not rushing, not panicking. He was calm. The image of his father, composed and dignified, strengthened Marcus's resolve. There was no hesitation, no fear, only the quiet pride of a man who had faced greater battles than this. Marcus's phone buzzed softly. A secure message flashed across the screen. It was from one of his old team members, all intel gathered. "You want the names confirmed?" "Yes," Marcus typed back. "Full confirmation. I need every detail." The hours passed. Marcus didn't move from the SUV. He watched as the officers arrived at the precinct, laughing and joking, completely unaware that someone was observing their every action. They went about their routine, thinking the night's incident was forgotten. But Marcus knew better. This wasn't about anger, it was about showing them that actions had consequences. Meanwhile, James went about his day, checking the mailbox, watering the small plants in his yard, and making calls to a few old friends. He kept himself busy, trying not to dwell on the previous night, but the memory of the officers' laughter and their careless shove lingered. His hands trembled slightly as he held the phone, realizing he had recorded everything. The video was safe, uploaded securely, and ready to be used if necessary. As the day wore on, Marcus made his move. He left the SUV and approached the officers' usual routes, blending into the background like a shadow. He observed them from a distance, taking notes, memorizing their patterns. He spoke to a few locals, casually asking questions about the officers' behavior without revealing his identity. Every piece of information built the larger picture he needed. By evening, Marcus returned home, watching as his father prepared dinner. James noticed Marcus sitting quietly in the living room, eyes distant. "Son," he said softly, "you've been quiet all day. What's on your mind?" Marcus turned his gaze to him. "They think this is over, Dad." "It's not. I need to make sure they understand the gravity of what they did." James frowned, concern evident in his eyes. "Marcus, I don't want you to get involved. Let it go. This isn't your war." Marcus shook his head gently. "It's my father, Dad. And no one mocks him without consequences. I learned that from you." James looked away, silent for a moment, then nodded. He knew his son meant what he said. Marcus had never been reckless, and when he acted, it was precise. He had to trust that Marcus would handle things with the discipline and control he had always taught him. Night fell, and with it came a quiet tension. Marcus positioned himself outside once again, eyes scanning the police station, noting the coming and going of officers, the patterns in their movements. He watched Blake and Cole, the two who had shoved and mocked his father. Their arrogance was clear in the way they moved, unaware that someone was carefully recording, analyzing, and planning every response. Inside the house, James sat by the window, glancing occasionally at the street. There was an uneasy silence, broken only by the occasional distant sound of traffic or barking dog. He sensed Marcus's presence nearby, though he couldn't see him. Something had changed in the city, in the air around him, a feeling that justice, or perhaps reckoning, was quietly approaching. Marcus's phone buzzed again. Another message from his team, Officer Blake and Cole both on duty tonight. No reinforcements nearby. Civilian witnesses minimal. Marcus's lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't move immediately. He observed, calculating, waiting. He knew this wasn't about confrontation, not yet. It was about timing, about showing the world the truth without giving the officers a chance to hide. Hours passed, and the city grew quieter. The usual hum of activity dimmed, leaving only the distant echoes of traffic and the rain-slicked streets. Marcus's eyes never wavered from the building. He replayed the video of his father in his mind, the calm, unbroken face of a man who had seen far more in a day than most could in a lifetime. That image strengthened his resolve. Finally, he leaned back against the SUV, silent and unseen, letting the night wrap around him. He whispered softly, not for anyone else to hear, but for himself, "They crossed the wrong man's father. And they're about to find out exactly who I am." Inside the house, James Carter finally went to bed, unaware that his son was already orchestrating a plan that would make the world notice, a plan that would ensure no one ever dared to humiliate him again. Outside, in the shadows, Marcus remained vigilant, a calm storm ready to strike, watching over the man who had taught him what it meant to be truly brave. The city slept, oblivious to the quiet reckoning that had begun. Somewhere, the two officers laughed again, thinking the night's events were forgotten. But Marcus Carter knew better. The storm had already started, and there would be no hiding from it. The city moved on as if nothing had happened. Rain had washed the streets clean, leaving a glistening reflection of streetlights on the asphalt. Inside his modest home, James Carter tried to put the previous night behind him. He brewed coffee, watered the plants on his porch, and ran through the motions of a normal day. He smiled politely at neighbors, chatted briefly with the mailman, and nodded to familiar faces. On the surface, everything seemed calm. But deep down, he knew he had been shaken, not by the push, not by the words, but by the thought that some people could so easily disrespect those who had fought for them. Across town, Marcus Carter had already begun his mission. The Delta Force commander didn't rush into action. That was never his way. He sat quietly in the shadows of his black SUV, watching the precinct where the officers had mocked his father. He observed their movements, noting every detail, the rhythm of their steps, their routines, the moments of arrogance that revealed their character. He wasn't planning to attack. He was gathering evidence, building a map of everything he needed to expose their wrongdoing fully. He started by speaking to the people around the officers, in subtle ways that didn't reveal who he was. At a coffee shop near the station, he struck up casual conversations. "Heard anything interesting about the local precinct?" he asked, with a smile that made him appear ordinary, harmless. But the questions were precise, calculated. Names, complaints, rumors, they all mattered. By the end of the day, he had compiled a list of every civilian who had filed a complaint against Blake and Cole, and a few more that had been quietly buried in the department's records. Back at the precinct, Blake and Cole acted as if nothing had changed. They laughed about last night in the locker room, mocking James Carter as if the world didn't notice. Marcus watched their behavior through binoculars, noting subtle changes in their expressions, small cracks in their confidence. He filed each observation carefully, each one a piece of a puzzle he was putting together with the patience and precision of a surgeon. By mid-afternoon, Marcus shifted tactics. He accessed public records, legal complaints, and news articles. Every officer in the department had a history, and while most of it was unremarkable, Blake and Cole had patterns of harassment and minor misconduct that had gone ignored. Marcus catalogued every single instance, highlighting those that could tie their behavior to systemic issues within the force. His eyes moved quickly across the screen, absorbing every detail. He wasn't just preparing to protect his father, he was preparing to expose a deeper truth. That evening, Marcus returned to his father's home. James was sitting on the porch with a blanket over his shoulders, watching the sky grow dark. He looked tired, but there was still the quiet strength that had carried him through years of battle. Marcus didn't announce himself at first, he simply sat beside his father, the silence stretching comfortably between them. "Long day?" James asked finally, glancing at him. "Longer than most," Marcus replied, his voice calm but firm. "They're reckless, Dad. They think what they did doesn't matter, but it does. I need to make sure they understand that." James studied him for a long moment. "Son, I've survived wars that would make most men crumble. I don't need you to fight this one." Marcus placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "It's not about fighting for myself, Dad. It's about protecting you, and making sure no one else thinks it's acceptable to humiliate someone like you." James shook his head slowly. "I fought my battles a long time ago. Let it go, son." Marcus didn't respond. He had already made up his mind. The sun disappeared entirely, leaving the city in shadows. Marcus rose and moved back toward the black SUV parked a short distance away. He opened his laptop, reviewing the day's collected intelligence, cross-referencing locations, names, and times. He prepared reports and compiled proof that would leave no room for denial. Every detail mattered, every pattern counted. This was not about vengeance. This was about justice, and Marcus did everything with the precision of a man trained for situations far deadlier than two arrogant officers. Night fell, and Marcus returned outside, parking strategically so he could observe the precinct without being noticed. Blake and Cole left briefly, heading to a late-night diner, unaware that their movements were already being tracked. Marcus followed them from a distance, careful to remain invisible. He listened to their conversations through the lens of careful observation, taking note of their arrogance and carelessness. He filed every word mentally, building a psychological map of their weaknesses. Back at his father's home, James sensed something unusual. He noticed the quiet hum of a car idling down the street, a presence that wasn't part of the ordinary neighborhood activity. He stepped onto the porch, squinting into the darkness, and thought he saw a shadow moving. It was just a fleeting moment, and he told himself it was nothing. But deep inside, he felt a strange reassurance, as if the universe itself had sent someone to watch over him. By midnight, Marcus had completed the first phase of his investigation. He now had the names, the histories, the patterns, and the proof he needed. But he didn't rush. There was no need for immediate confrontation. He would wait for the right moment, when his actions could have the most impact. Sitting quietly inside the SUV, Marcus whispered to himself, "They think it's just a video on the internet. They have no idea what's coming. They don't know who I am." The night was still, the streets empty, the city unaware that a storm was silently forming just blocks away. Marcus's eyes never left the precinct, never left the officers he was watching. And somewhere deep in the heart of the city, a quiet reckoning had already begun. He closed his laptop and leaned back, breathing slowly. "Patience wins wars," he murmured, echoing the words his father had taught him. He had learned discipline, control, and precision from James Carter. Now, it was time to put all those lessons to work, not on foreign battlefields, but here at home. Outside, Blake and Cole laughed in their diner booth, oblivious. Inside the SUV, Marcus watched. And in the quiet of the night, he made a silent promise: no one would humiliate his father again. The city awoke slowly, the streets still damp from rain, the air thick with the scent of wet asphalt and early morning coffee. Life moved on as if nothing had happened the night before, but for James Carter, the world felt heavier. He brewed his coffee, watered the plants on the porch, and tried to slip into his daily routine. He smiled at neighbors, exchanged polite greetings with familiar faces, and did his best to seem normal. But the memory of the previous night, the laughter, the shove, the disrespect, stayed with him like a shadow that refused to leave. He didn't know that Marcus Carter had already begun the next phase of his plan. The Delta Force commander had spent the early morning hours tracking the officers from a distance, following their routines, and cross-checking records of past complaints. Every detail mattered. Marcus wasn't interested in confrontation yet, he wanted preparation, strategy, and control. He had never acted impulsively, and this was no exception. Meanwhile, the video James had captured and uploaded privately had begun to circulate online. Someone had shared it accidentally, and now it was spreading faster than James could have imagined. Social media feeds began to fill with comments, shares, and outraged messages. This is unacceptable. How can they treat a war hero this way? Justice for James Carter. The clip struck a chord with thousands across the city and beyond. At the precinct, Blake and Cole were oblivious. They went about their usual routines, joking and laughing, mocking the idea that anyone could care about what happened. It's just the internet, Blake said with a smirk, tossing a coffee cup into the trash. Nobody's paying attention. But Marcus was paying attention. From a nearby parking lot, he observed the officers as they arrived for their shifts. He saw the subtle tension in their movements, the small glances over their shoulders that hinted at unease. People were beginning to notice, and he had already ensured that every shred of evidence against them was carefully documented. By mid-morning, Marcus had contacted a few trusted allies, former Delta teammates, friends still in intelligence, and one journalist known for exposing corruption. He shared the carefully gathered proof, recordings, witness statements, and the officer's own misconduct history. Every piece of information was clear, undeniable, and damning. Back at home, James tried to ignore the news spreading online, though he could feel it brushing against him like an electric current. He didn't want to believe his private humiliation had become public spectacle, but deep down, he felt a strange mixture of hope and fear. He hoped for justice but feared the potential consequences for his son. Later that evening, Marcus returned home briefly, bringing with him the quiet tension of someone who had been working behind the scenes all day. He watched his father from the doorway as James prepared dinner, humming a soft tune he had learned in the army, a tune that had comforted him through countless hardships. "They're paying attention now," Marcus said quietly, breaking the silence. James looked up, eyes concerned. "They? Who's paying attention?" Marcus placed a hand gently on his father's shoulder. "Everyone. The city. The news. People are sharing the video. They're noticing what happened to you. But the two officers, they still don't realize how serious this is." James shook his head. "Son, I don't want you to get involved. Let it go. This isn't your fight." Marcus's jaw tightened. "It's not about a fight, Dad. It's about showing them that actions have consequences. It's about respect, about justice, and about making sure no one else ever feels what you felt last night." The sun disappeared completely, leaving the city in shadows. Marcus positioned himself outside once again, ready to observe the precinct and the officers' routines. Blake and Cole left for a late-night errand, oblivious to the fact that Marcus was tracking them, noting their every movement. Every laugh, every careless gesture, every misstep, they were all recorded in his mind and on his secure devices. Inside the house, James sat quietly by the window, noticing a familiar black SUV parked just a block away. He felt a strange comfort, as though someone was silently watching over him. He didn't know it was his son, planning every move with precision, ensuring that justice would not only be served but witnessed. By midnight, Marcus had completed another round of careful surveillance. He now had enough evidence and observation to move closer to exposing the truth. But he didn't act recklessly. He understood patience, the kind his father had taught him. The right moment would come, and when it did, the impact would be undeniable. As he leaned back in the SUV, watching the faint glow of the city lights, Marcus whispered to himself, "They thought this was just another video. They have no idea what's coming. They have no idea who I am." Outside, Blake and Cole laughed in a diner, joking about the viral video as if it were nothing more than a passing joke. But in the shadows, Marcus remained calm, unwavering. The quiet storm had begun, and soon, the city would witness a reckoning unlike anything they had imagined. And back home, James Carter finally went to bed, unaware that his son had already begun a plan to restore not just his dignity, but the dignity of every veteran who had ever been disrespected. Outside, the streets slept, but Marcus Carter's eyes did not. He watched, he waited, and he prepared for the moment when the truth would demand attention. The city was waking up. And soon, so would justice. The city was alive with whispers. Social media feeds, news channels, and neighborhood gossip all carried one story: an elderly black veteran had been humiliated by local police. James Carter's name began to trend, though he remained unaware of just how far the story had spread. Inside his home, he moved through the familiar motions of his day, making coffee, tending to plants, and reading letters from old friends, but there was an unusual weight in the air, a tension he could not shake. Meanwhile, Marcus Carter had shifted into the next phase of his plan. The Delta Force commander didn't act impulsively, but he acted decisively. He had gathered every piece of evidence: recordings of the officers' harassment, witness statements from locals, and records of Blake and Cole's history of misconduct. Each file, each detail, was carefully organized, ready to be deployed in a way that would leave no room for denial. By mid-morning, Marcus contacted a trusted journalist, someone known for uncovering corruption and speaking truth to power. He shared the full evidence, laying it out with clarity and precision. There was no exaggeration, no manipulation, just facts, undeniable and damning. The journalist, a woman named Carla Hayes, studied the files in silence. This is massive," she said finally, her voice steady but filled with disbelief. "If we publish this, it's going to shake the whole department." Marcus nodded, his eyes calm but intense. "It's not about shaking departments. It's about showing the truth. My father didn't deserve what happened. Nobody should." As the day progressed, the news began to spread. Clips from the video circulated online, with captions emphasizing James Carter's service and bravery. Comments poured in from around the country: "A hero deserves respect, not humiliation. This is why we need accountability. Justice for James Carter." The city's mood shifted. People who had never paid attention to local incidents began to demand answers. Inside the precinct, Blake and Cole felt the change immediately. They arrived for their shifts to whispers and sideways glances from colleagues. Some officers kept their distance, uneasy in the growing storm of scrutiny. Blake's face tightened with frustration, while Cole muttered under his breath, pretending to ignore the pressure but visibly rattled. Marcus watched from a distance, unseen, analyzing every reaction. He didn't act out of anger, he acted with precision. Every movement, every exposure, was calculated to maximize impact while minimizing unnecessary confrontation. That evening, Marcus returned home briefly. James was sitting on the porch, watching the darkening sky, unaware of the full extent of what was unfolding. "The city's talking," Marcus said quietly, taking a seat beside his father. James looked at him with concern. "Son, what have you done?" Marcus smiled faintly, a controlled smile without humor. "I haven't done anything yet. I'm just making sure the truth is seen. They need to know what they did was wrong, and that it won't go unnoticed." James shook his head. "I don't want you to hurt anyone. Let it go." Marcus's gaze held steady. "I'm not going to hurt anyone, Dad. Not physically. But they need to feel the weight of accountability. And the world is watching." Later that night, Marcus returned to his observation post outside the precinct. Blake and Cole left briefly for a late-night errand, unaware that Marcus was tracking their every move. He watched them enter a diner, their body language tense, their conversations clipped and cautious. The realization of public attention had begun to unsettle them. Meanwhile, news alerts continued to flood phones across the city. Reports emphasized James Carter's service, the officers' misconduct, and the growing public outrage. People began showing up outside the precinct, holding signs and speaking out. Small crowds grew into larger groups, all demanding answers. Inside the diner, Blake and Cole finally realized they were cornered, not by force, but by the exposure of truth. Fear began to seep in where arrogance had once resided. Blake glanced at Cole and muttered, This is bigger than I thought." Marcus, still hidden in the shadows, observed silently. He had no need to intervene directly yet. The system, now nudged by the undeniable evidence and public attention, was already moving in his favor. Internal affairs had been notified, and higher-ups were beginning to act. Back at his father's house, James finally allowed himself to sit and watch the news. He felt a mix of disbelief and pride. The city, the country, was beginning to recognize the injustice. And somewhere deep down, he knew that Marcus had orchestrated this with the same discipline and honor that had always guided him. By midnight, the first official action came. Blake and Cole were suspended pending investigation. Their colleagues whispered, some relieved, others shocked. Marcus smiled faintly in the darkness, knowing the first step toward true justice had been taken. He returned to his father's porch once again. The night was quiet now, the city temporarily at rest. James looked at his son, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and concern. "You've done enough, Marcus," he said softly. Marcus shook his head gently. "It's not enough yet. But we've started the right path. Justice isn't just about punishment, it's about proving that dignity matters. And your dignity matters more than anything." James placed a hand on his son's shoulder, feeling the steady warmth and strength he had always known. "You fight differently than I did. You use your mind as well as your strength." Marcus nodded, a quiet determination settling over him. "I learned from the best." Outside, the city slept, unaware of the careful orchestration behind the unfolding justice. But Marcus Carter knew the truth had been seen, and the officers who had mocked and humiliated his father would never forget the lesson they were about to learn. The night was calm, but the storm of accountability had already begun. And Marcus Carter, disciplined, patient, and unyielding, was at its center. The morning light crept over the city, cutting through the haze of early fog. News stations blared headlines across televisions, radios, and social media feeds. Black veteran humiliated by police, son steps in to expose the truth. Across the country, people were talking, sharing, and demanding accountability. The story of James Carter, a 71-year-old war hero, had struck a chord. And behind every headline, every social media post, was Marcus Carter, quietly orchestrating the final steps of a reckoning that had begun weeks ago. Inside his home, James Carter moved carefully through his morning routine. He felt a strange mixture of relief and worry. Relief because justice had begun to take shape, worry because his son's involvement could draw dangerous attention. He brewed his coffee, sat on the porch, and watched the street, unaware that Marcus had already positioned himself strategically nearby, eyes on every entrance, every movement. By midday, Marcus had begun coordinating with the journalist Carla Hayes, ensuring that the next phase of exposure would have maximum impact. He provided her with additional evidence, officer complaint files, photos, timestamps, and even audio recordings that corroborated the previous night's harassment. Carla studied each piece meticulously, knowing that once published, this story would shake more than just the local precinct, it would reach a national audience. "They'll have nowhere to hide," Marcus said calmly. Carla nodded. "This is going to go viral. But are you ready for the consequences?" Marcus's jaw tightened slightly, his eyes cold and focused. "I've never been unprepared. This is about truth, not me." Meanwhile, at the precinct, Blake and Cole were already feeling the pressure. Their suspension orders sat in their hands, official documents that made their previous arrogance impossible to defend. Colleagues whispered behind their backs, some sympathetic, some quietly celebrating the long-overdue accountability. But both officers were unnerved, aware that the world was now watching, and that someone had orchestrated their exposure with precision. As evening approached, Marcus made his move. He arrived at the precinct, not to confront the officers physically, but to ensure public recognition of the injustice. Dressed in casual civilian clothes, blending into the crowd that had begun to gather outside, he watched quietly as reporters, citizens, and activists assembled, demanding answers and justice for James Carter. Inside the precinct, the officers sat nervously, listening to the chatter outside. The tension was palpable. Blake muttered under his breath, "Who even is organizing this?" Cole's eyes darted toward the windows. "I don't know, but whoever it is, they're good." Outside, Marcus finally stepped forward. He allowed himself to be seen, walking toward the crowd. His presence was commanding, not because of violence, but because of the aura of control and authority he carried. People recognized him instantly, some whispering, others stepping back in awe. A former colleague from his Delta Force days noticed him and nodded subtly, acknowledging the man's disciplined power. Marcus approached a microphone held by Carla Hayes. Cameras focused, capturing every movement, every expression. He spoke calmly, measured, and deliberately. "My father, James Carter, served this country with honor. Last night, he was humiliated by two officers who thought they could disregard the dignity of a man who sacrificed for this nation. That ends today." The crowd erupted in murmurs and applause. Marcus held up a folder of evidence. "We have documented everything. Witness statements, complaints, videos, and reports. This is not just about my father, it is about ensuring respect, justice, and accountability for all who serve and all who deserve to be treated with dignity." Inside the precinct, Blake and Cole's faces drained of color as they watched the live coverage on a small television in their break room. Fear replaced arrogance. Panic settled into their movements. Their colleagues avoided eye contact, and whispers about the viral video and public outrage filled the room. Outside, the story spread further. Reporters captured the crowd, the evidence, and Marcus's calm, commanding presence. Social media exploded. Hashtags like #JusticeForJamesCarter, #VeteransDeserveRespect, and #AccountabilityNow trended nationwide. The officers could no longer hide behind their badges or arrogance, the world was watching. Later that evening, Marcus returned home. James was sitting on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the horizon. He didn't need to ask what had happened. The city's reaction, the national attention, it was clear. Marcus sat beside him, calm and composed. "It's done, Dad. People know the truth. They're paying attention. The officers can't ignore this anymore." James looked at his son, eyes filled with a mixture of pride and concern. "You did all this for me?" Marcus shook his head slightly. "Not just for you. This is about everyone who has ever been humiliated, ignored, or disrespected. You were just the spark that reminded people why it matters." James smiled faintly, taking a sip of his coffee. "I always knew you were special, Marcus. But this is something else entirely." Marcus placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "You taught me that dignity and discipline matter more than strength or firepower. Tonight, we reminded the world of that lesson." As the city lights twinkled in the distance, the storm of public accountability had reached its peak. Marcus Carter had not raised a gun, shouted, or used force. He had relied on intelligence, precision, and the undeniable truth. And in doing so, he had ensured that the world, and the officers who had humiliated his father, would never forget the power of justice tempered with discipline. James leaned back, the weight of relief settling over him. "You fought differently than I did," he murmured. Marcus smiled faintly, looking out into the city. "I fought the right way." Outside, the night was calm, but the lesson had been delivered. Justice had been served, not with violence, but with truth, patience, and unwavering resolve. And for Marcus Carter, that was the only victory that truly mattered. The city had changed overnight. Social media feeds, news reports, and neighborhood conversations carried one unshakable truth: James Carter, a veteran who had served his country with honor, had been humiliated, and the world had witnessed it. But more importantly, the man who had orchestrated justice, his son, Marcus Carter, had ensured that dignity and accountability were restored. Inside their home, James moved with a sense of quiet relief. The weight of humiliation that had pressed on him for days was finally lifting. The coffee on the table steamed gently in the morning light, and the sound of birds outside seemed almost celebratory. He didn't need to ask, he already knew what had happened. The city, the nation, and the world had seen the truth, and justice had been served. Marcus sat across from him, calm and composed. Unlike the headlines, the chaos, or the public attention, he remained a figure of controlled strength. He had done what needed to be done without violence, without anger, and without personal vengeance. His father's dignity had been restored, and the officers responsible were facing the consequences of their actions. "Son," James said quietly, his voice carrying a mixture of pride and awe, "you handled this differently than I ever would have imagined. You didn't raise a fist, you didn't shout, yet you made sure the world knew the truth." Marcus nodded. "I learned from the best, Dad. Discipline, patience, intelligence, those are the tools that win battles without unnecessary harm. You taught me that." Outside, the city was still buzzing. News outlets covered every angle, focusing on the viral video, the public outrage, and the disciplined, calculated way Marcus had orchestrated the exposure. The two officers, Blake and Cole, had been suspended and faced internal investigations, their reputations shattered. People across the country were discussing accountability, respect for veterans, and the power of truth. James felt a hand on his shoulder. He looked up to see Marcus standing quietly beside him. "It's over, Dad," Marcus said softly. "They've learned their lesson. The city has learned a lesson. And most importantly, your honor is intact." James's eyes glistened with tears he refused to shed in front of anyone else. "You've done more than just protect me, Marcus. You've reminded everyone that respect is not optional. That dignity cannot be taken lightly." Marcus leaned back in his chair, the weight of recent days settling over him. He thought of the careful planning, the hours of surveillance, and the strategic exposure. Every step had been necessary. Every action calculated. And now, the storm had passed, leaving clarity and justice in its wake. The sun rose higher, casting warm light over the neighborhood. James stepped outside onto the porch, breathing deeply, feeling a renewed sense of peace. Marcus joined him silently, their shoulders almost touching, a quiet bond of understanding passing between them. The world outside could continue its chaos, but here, in this small corner of the city, balance had been restored. "Do you ever regret it?" James asked, breaking the silence. Marcus shook his head slowly. "Never. I only wish more people would act with courage and discipline like this when injustice occurs. Violence isn't necessary when truth is powerful." James smiled, the faintest of proud smiles. "You've changed the game, son. Not just for me, but for everyone watching." The camera flashes and social media notifications that had once signaled chaos were now replaced by calm admiration. Stories of the disciplined, intelligent son who had protected his father's honor spread across platforms, inspiring countless viewers. For Marcus, the reward was not the attention, it was knowing that his father's dignity, hard-earned over decades of service, had been restored. As evening fell, the two men sat on the porch together, the city lights twinkling in the distance. Marcus looked out at the horizon, calm and measured, already thinking ahead to the next mission, the next challenge. James rested his hand on his son's shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of the strength and honor he had passed down and the way it had been used to protect what mattered most. The night was quiet, the storm had passed, and respect had been restored. The world had witnessed not just a reckoning, but the quiet, precise power of truth, patience, and discipline. And for Marcus and James Carter, that was more than enough. The story had ended, but its impact would echo far beyond the streets where it began. Justice had not only been served, it had been shown in its most disciplined, honorable, and effective form.